Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is the 1958 science fiction horror classic, The Blob. Now, The Blob is one of my all-time favorite movies. I really grew up on this movie, and I have the movie on VHS. Now, I know Criterion has a DVD and Blu-ray out of this movie, but truth be told, I really grew up on the movie watching it on this beat-up old VHS tape that I almost can't see myself watching this on DVD or Blu-ray. But The Blob is such a fun, cheesy B-movie. For me, this is almost the definitive 50s B-movie. Now, The Blob was actually an independent film, but it was distributed by Paramount. Now, The Blob is perhaps most famous for being the first film that features Steve McQueen in a starring role. Now, this was not Steve McQueen's first movie, but this was the first movie where he was a leading man. In some ways, Steve McQueen kind of owes his career to this movie, even though I heard he was actually kind of embarrassed by this movie, and when he was first making this movie, he was convinced that the movie wasn't going to do well. Now, the original story idea for this movie was conceived by Irvin Millgate, and the screenplay for this movie was written by Theodore Simonson and actress Kate Linaker. The movie was also produced by Jack H. Harris, who would go on to produce a lot of horror and exploitation movies. Now, the plot of The Blob is it's about this meteor that lands by this small town, and this old hermit finds the meteor, and he starts poking it with a stick, and all of a sudden the meteor cracks open, and out comes this alien ooze, and the alien ooze gets on his hand, and it's actually acidic, and it starts eating his hand away, and it starts spreading throughout his entire arm. Eventually, he's picked up by these two teenagers named Steve Andrews and Jane Martin. The character of Steve Andrews is, of course, played by Steve McQueen. They end up taking the old man to this local doctor, and eventually this alien ooze spreads throughout the old man's entire body, and it literally dissolves the old man. The creature then kills a nurse and the doctor. Steve ends up witnessing the doctor get killed by this thing, and throughout the movie he's trying to tell the townspeople about this creature, but no one will believe him. And throughout the movie, the creature ends up eating more people, and the more it eats, the bigger it gets, and this creature has the potential to consume the entire town, and possibly the entire planet. But yeah, The Blob is a great 50s B-movie and a tremendously fun film. And one thing I think is really interesting, now as I mentioned before, for me this film is almost like the definitive 50s B-movie. At the same time though, the movie actually doesn't really feel like a 50s movie. For me it actually feels like more of an early 60s film. And maybe that's because most of the horror and science fiction films from the 1950s that I've seen were more mainstream films, and once again, this was really an independent film that was released by Paramount. And the movie really does have this nice low-budget feel. At the same time, though, even though this film had a low budget, I would argue that it's a relatively well-made movie. And sure, some of the effects in the movie might be a little cheesy. At the same time, though, there are some shots of the Blob in this film that I actually think are really cool looking. And I think the Blob is, for the most part, a really cool looking monster. I also really love the look for this movie. Like, this movie uses colors and lighting really well, and like the reds for the Blob really do pop out. I also think it's a relatively well-acted movie as well. Sure, a lot of the acting is really melodramatic, but at the same time though, there were a lot of mainstream movies around this time that also had really melodramatic acting. That was just sort of a style of acting during the 1950s. But for his first starring role, I actually think Steve McQueen does do a really good job in this movie, and the character of Steve Andrews is a really likable character. The one thing I do find to be kind of hilarious about Steve McQueen being casted in this movie is the fact that he's supposed to be playing a teenager, yet he was 28 when they made this movie, and honestly, I was surprised he was that young, because he actually looks older than 28 in this movie, yet he's supposed to be playing a 17-year-old boy. I find that to be really hilarious because he's around the same age as some of the actors playing the adults in the movie. But then again, none of the teenage characters in this movie actually look like teenagers. Now, the only bit of acting in this movie that I think genuinely sucks is the kid who plays Jane's younger brother in this movie. Like, even as a little kid watching this movie, I wanted to beat this kid up. But the characters in this movie I actually think are really likable. Like Steve's girlfriend Jane, I do actually think is a really likable character. And then you had some of Steve's friends in the movie who, his friends were actually really funny to me because they almost seem like characters from a 50s sitcom in a lot of ways. And I'm not saying that like it's a bad thing, honestly that's something I really like about the movie. And also some of the adult characters in this movie are really likable, like the character of Lieutenant Dave is a really likable character. You also have a character named Sergeant Burt who is a real dick, yet at the same time though, he is likable as well. Another thing I really like about this movie is the film's actually quite funny. And honestly, there are certain points in this movie where it almost plays out like a satire of what B-movies around this time were, but I don't think it was actually intended that way. But there are certain aspects of this film where it's clear that their tongues were in their cheeks. Like you have the opening theme song of the movie, Beware the Blob, which is a really fun song. Like, it's clear that they were trying to be silly with that. And you also have some other intentionally funny moments in the movie, like, there's a scene in the movie when Steve Andrews and his friends are trying to warn the townspeople about the Blob. He has his friends, like, honking their car horns, and, like, he's waking up the entire town, and there's a little scene where you see this old man get up, and he's trying to decide what to wear, and he thinks it's an emergency. You also have another really comedic scene where two of Steve Andrews' friends are out looking for the monster, and they accidentally stumble upon this couple making out, and the boyfriend clearly is about to kick their asses, and the guy's like, well, we're sorry, we were just looking for a monster. So there are a lot of scenes in this movie that were clearly meant to be funny. I don't know if I would say the film is a full-fledged horror comedy, but there are a lot of really comedic aspects of this movie. But yeah, The Blob is a great movie. This is definitely one of my favorite B-movies from the 1950s, and I'll admit, a lot of my love for this movie might just be nostalgia. At the same time, though, I still think this movie is just a really fun film. And there are so many really iconic scenes from this movie, like the movie theater scene and the diner scene. Now, The Blob went on to become a cult classic, and it would spawn a sequel in 1972 titled Beware the Blob. There was also a remake made to this movie in 1988, and the remake has also spawned a cult following of its own, and as much as I do love this movie, I actually like the remake even better. Now, this movie seems to have had an influence on at least two Stephen King stories. Stephen King wrote a short story entitled Weeds, which was adapted into one of the segments of the anthology film Creepshow. And it was also adapted as one of the stories in the graphic novelization of Creepshow. And the short story Weeds by Stephen King does have a somewhat similar premise to The Blob, in the sense that it's about an alien ooze that comes out of a meteor. The only difference is this ooze doesn't eat people, it just causes weeds to grow everywhere, and it causes the main character of the story to turn into a weed. But I would not be surprised if Stephen King maybe took some inspiration from this movie for that short story. Stephen King also wrote a short story titled The Raft, which was published in his collection Skeleton Crew, and it was adapted as one of the segments of the anthology film Creepshow 2. And the villain of that story was a lake monster that was a somewhat similar creature to the Blob in this movie. And once again, I would not be surprised if maybe Stephen King took some inspiration from the Blob for the villain from his story The Raft. But yeah, that was my review on The Blob, and my next movie review will be on Beware the Blob.